"I'm sorry, ma'am. This table is reserved for staff and assistants," the hostess whispered as she glanced at my name badge. My husband stood 20 feet away beneath a crystal chandelier, laughing with investors and city officials, and he never once looked in my direction. That was the moment I realized I hadn't been invited to the gala as Richard Whitmore's wife. I had been invited as someone he hoped nobody would notice. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and this is my true story from Indiana. The ballroom of the Meridian Grand Hotel glowed with golden light that reflected from hundreds of crystal glasses and polished silver trays. Outside, the Indianapolis skyline shimmered against the cool October evening. Inside, more than 300 guests filled the room, dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. It was the most important corporate gala in our company's history. At least, that was what Richard had told me. The company he had spent 4 decades building was being sold, and tonight was supposed to celebrate the transition. I had spent nearly 2 hours getting ready. At 69 years old, I no longer cared about fashion trends, but I still wanted to look presentable. I chose a navy blue evening dress and a pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. Richard barely glanced at me when we left our home that evening. During the 40-minute drive into the city, he spent most of the time answering calls and sending messages. Whenever I tried to make conversation, his responses were short and distracted. I told myself he was nervous about the sale. It was a major moment in his life. But something felt different. Something felt cold. The feeling only grew stronger when we arrived at the hotel. The valet greeted Richard immediately. Several executives walked over to shake his hand. Cameras flashed. Reporters called his name. Yet nobody acknowledged me. Not a single person. At first, I thought it was accidental. Then I noticed how Richard introduced everyone around him. "This is our chief financial officer. This is our legal advisor. This is one of our board members." He introduced every person standing nearby. Everyone except me. The woman who had spent 42 years beside him. The woman who had helped build the company from a tiny office above a hardware store into a regional success. I stood there smiling while feeling invisible. Eventually, Richard leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "Why don't you sit at one of the back tables until the presentation starts?" he said. "It'll be easier." Easier for whom? I wondered. But I nodded. I always nodded. That was what wives like me did. We supported. We sacrificed. We stayed quiet. I walked toward the rear of the ballroom and found my assigned seat. Table 27, near the service entrance. Close enough to hear dishes clatter from the kitchen. Far from the stage. Far from the executives. Far from Richard. I stared at the small place card bearing my name. Margaret Whitmore. The letters looked strangely unfamiliar. Across the room, Richard stood beneath the brightest lights in the building. Confident. Celebrated. Important. For a moment, our eyes met. Then he looked away, as if he barely knew me. I lowered my gaze to the untouched glass of sparkling water in front of me and wondered how a woman could spend 42 years helping build a life with someone only to become a stranger in the room where that life was being celebrated. And then, just as the evening's main event was about to begin, I noticed a man near the stage staring directly at me. Unlike everyone else in the ballroom, he seemed to know exactly who I was. The man remained near the stage, speaking quietly with several executives while the guests settled into their seats. I could not explain why I kept looking at him. Perhaps it was because he was the only person in the room who had acknowledged my existence. Or perhaps it was because his expression carried something I had not seen all evening. Recognition. I looked away and folded my hands in my lap. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as servers moved between tables carrying plates of herb-roasted chicken and vegetables. Conversations blended into a soft murmur. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter echoed from the tables near the front. None of it reached table 27. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the stage but felt separated from the celebration itself. It reminded me of something I had felt many times over the past few years. Present, but not included. Visible, but somehow unseen. I took a sip of water and found myself drifting into memories I had not visited in a long time. There was a time when Richard and I had shared everything. 42 years earlier, we had lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Indianapolis. The company existed only as an idea scribbled onto legal pads spread across our kitchen table. We had no investors, no board members, no media coverage. We barely had enough money to pay rent some months. Richard worked long hours chasing contracts while I handled invoices, bookkeeping, customer calls, and whatever else needed to be done. During the day, I worked at a local bank. At night, I sat beside him balancing accounts until midnight. There were evenings when we shared a single takeout meal because that was all we could afford. We laughed then. We dreamed together then. When the company nearly collapsed during its third year, I remember withdrawing money from a savings account my father had left me. It was not a fortune, $28,000. But at the time it felt enormous. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to pay employees. Enough to give Richard another chance. I never thought of it as a sacrifice. We were building something together. At least, that was what I believed. Over the years, the company grew. Offices expanded. Employees multiplied. Revenue increased. Awards filled shelves. The larger the company became, the smaller my role seemed to appear in public. At first, it happened gradually. Richard stopped mentioning my contributions during interviews. Then my name disappeared from speeches. Then from anniversary events. Eventually, people began referring to me simply as Richard's wife. As if I had arrived after the success rather than before it. As if I had merely observed the journey instead of helping create it. I told myself it did not matter. Recognition was never my goal. Family mattered. Partnership mattered. But sitting alone at that back table, watching strangers celebrate a history they did not understand, I felt a quiet ache settle deep inside me. Across the room, Richard stood surrounded by admirers. Beside him was a younger woman I had noticed earlier. Elegant. Confident. Several guests smiled at her and spoke as though she belonged at his side. Richard never corrected them. He never introduced her to me either. I looked down at my place card again. Margaret Whitmore. For a long moment, I simply stared at the name. Then I heard movement near the stage. The man I had been watching stepped toward the microphone. The room immediately fell silent. And before he spoke a single word, his eyes found mine once again. The man adjusted the microphone and waited until the final conversations faded into silence. The confidence in his posture suggested he was accustomed to commanding rooms like this. A large screen behind him displayed the company logo that Richard had spent decades promoting. Applause filled the ballroom as the master of ceremonies introduced him as Ethan Brooks, the new owner and chief executive officer. Richard stood near the front row with a proud smile. The younger woman remained beside him, nodding politely as guests congratulated them. I watched from my seat near the service entrance, feeling as though I were observing someone else's life. Ethan thanked the guests for attending and spoke about the future of the company. His voice was calm and measured. He discussed growth, innovation, and community partnerships throughout Indiana. The audience listened attentively. Every few moments, I noticed his gaze moving across the room. More than once, it settled on me. It was unsettling. I could not remember ever meeting him before. After several minutes, Ethan shifted away from future plans and began discussing the company's history. He praised employees, managers, and community leaders who had contributed to its success. Richard seemed pleased. He folded his hands confidently and nodded at several familiar names. Then Ethan said something unexpected. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about people whose contributions never appeared in headlines. People whose names were rarely printed in annual reports. The room grew quieter. I felt my attention sharpen. Ethan smiled slightly and glanced at a stack of notes resting on the podium. When I began reviewing company archives during the acquisition process, he said, I discovered a fascinating story buried beneath decades of paperwork. A few guests exchanged curious looks. Richard's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Ethan continued. He described the company's early years. The cramped office. The financial struggles. The uncertainty. Every detail sounded strangely familiar because I had lived through those years. My pulse quickened. Then Ethan mentioned a private loan that had saved the company during a severe cash flow crisis. $28,000. The exact amount I had withdrawn from my inheritance account more than 40 years earlier. My fingers tightened around my water glass. Surely it was a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it was not. Ethan looked toward the audience again. Without that loan, he said, this company would likely have disappeared before its fourth year. Several guests nodded thoughtfully. Richard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. It was a small movement, but after 42 years of marriage, I recognized discomfort when I saw it. Ethan went on to describe handwritten ledgers, financial records, and strategic planning documents preserved in storage. documents that revealed a story different from the one many people believed. Around me, guests leaned forward with growing interest. The younger woman beside Richard appeared confused. She whispered something to him. He did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the stage. For the first time that evening, he looked nervous. I glanced down at my place card once more. Margaret Whitmore. The name suddenly felt heavier than it had earlier. On stage, Ethan closed his folder and rested both hands on the podium. A faint smile crossed his face. Then he spoke a sentence that caused my heart to stop for a moment. The remarkable woman responsible for much of that early survival is here with us tonight, he said. And as hundreds of guests began looking around the ballroom, his eyes settled directly on me. For a second, nobody moved. Hundreds of faces searched the ballroom, trying to identify the person Ethan was describing. I remained frozen in my chair. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear the quiet whispers spreading across the room. Ethan raised a hand toward the back of the ballroom. There was no uncertainty in his gesture. He was pointing directly at me. "Mrs. Margaret Whitmore," he said warmly. "Would you please stand?" The room seemed to stop breathing. I looked around instinctively, almost expecting him to be speaking to someone else. But there was nobody else. Every eye in the ballroom had turned toward table 27. Slowly, I pushed back my chair and rose to my feet. A wave of murmurs rolled through the audience. Some guests looked surprised. Others appeared confused. A few executives exchanged glances as if trying to understand why a woman seated near the service entrance had suddenly become the center of attention. Ethan smiled. "There she is." His voice carried clearly through the ballroom speakers. "Many of you know the company's public story. Very few know the complete story." I could feel my hands trembling slightly, so I clasped them together. Across the room, Richard stood perfectly still. His expression had become unreadable. The younger woman beside him looked from Ethan to me and back again. Ethan continued. "During our acquisition review, my team examined thousands of archived documents, financial records, internal reports, strategic planning notes, handwritten correspondence." He paused briefly. One name appeared over and over again during the years when this company was fighting to survive. The ballroom remained silent. Margaret Whitmore. My chest tightened. I had not heard my name spoken with that kind of respect in a very long time. Ethan picked up a folder from the podium. In 1989, when cash reserves nearly disappeared, Mrs. Whitmore personally provided critical funding that allowed operations to continue. Several guests visibly reacted. I heard a few quiet gasps. Ethan opened another page. What impressed me even more was discovering detailed planning documents written in her own handwriting. Market expansion proposals, budget restructuring recommendations, customer retention strategies. He looked directly at the audience. Many of the practices that helped this company survive difficult years originated from her work. The whispers grew louder. I saw executives turning toward Richard. Some appeared genuinely shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. The history they thought they knew was changing in front of them. I remembered writing those plans late at night at our kitchen table. I remembered balancing ledgers while Richard slept upstairs before early business trips. I remembered believing that one day none of those sacrifices would matter because we were building something together. Ethan's next words struck even deeper. "Success has many public faces," he said. "But sometimes the most important contributions come from people who never ask for recognition." He closed the folder gently. "Tonight, before we discuss the future of this company, I believe we should acknowledge someone who helped make that future possible." The ballroom erupted into applause. It began near the front tables, then spread throughout the room until nearly everyone was clapping. I stood there overwhelmed, unable to speak. For the first time that evening, I no longer felt invisible. And as the applause continued, I noticed something I never expected to see. Richard lowered his eyes. The applause seemed to continue forever. I stood there beneath the attention of people who had not known my name 10 minutes earlier. Some smiled warmly. Others appeared embarrassed, as though they had suddenly realized they had overlooked someone important. I did not know where to look. My eyes drifted across the ballroom until they found Richard again. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like to be acknowledged for the work I had done. I thought it would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt strangely sad. Because recognition arriving 40 years late carries a different weight than recognition given at the right time. Ethan waited patiently until the applause faded. Then he stepped away from the podium and walked toward the edge of the stage. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "would you honor us by joining me for a moment?" A member of the hotel staff immediately approached my table. Suddenly, the same people who had barely noticed me earlier were offering assistance. Chairs moved aside. Guests smiled and nodded as I made my way through the ballroom. The walk could not have been more than 70 feet, yet it felt much longer. As I passed the front tables, several executives stood to shake my hand. Others introduced themselves. Many seemed genuinely surprised to learn who I was. When I reached the stage, Ethan greeted me with a respectful handshake. His expression was sincere. There was no performance in it. No attempt to impress the audience. Only respect. "Thank you for standing up here with me," he said quietly. Then he turned back toward the crowd. "There is one more thing I would like everyone to see." The large screen behind him changed. A scanned document appeared. I immediately recognized it. It was one of my old handwritten planning sheets from the early years of the company. My neat blue ink filled the page. Notes, projections, budget calculations, ideas I had written at our kitchen table after long workdays. A soft murmur swept through the audience. Another document appeared. Then another. Loan records, internal correspondence, strategic plans. Each one carried my name. Each one proved the same thing. I had not simply been present during the company's beginning. I had helped shape it. Ethan explained how his review team had uncovered hundreds of documents connecting me directly to key decisions during the company's most difficult years. He spoke carefully, never exaggerating, never diminishing anyone else's role. Yet with every piece of evidence displayed on the screen, the truth became harder to ignore. I glanced toward Richard. Several guests were speaking to him now. Their expressions had changed. Earlier, they had congratulated him. Now they seemed to be asking questions. Difficult questions. Beside him, the younger woman looked increasingly uncomfortable. She folded her arms and avoided eye contact with those around her. For the first time all evening, the spotlight was no longer fixed on Richard. The story belonged to someone else. Ethan finally turned toward me again. "Many people contribute to success," he said. "But character is revealed by what someone does when there is no audience and no promise of recognition." The ballroom fell silent. I felt emotion rise in my throat, but I kept my composure. Years of disappointment had taught me how to remain steady. Then Ethan smiled and said something that changed everything. "Mrs. Whitmore, there is a reason I wanted you here tonight, and it has nothing to do with the acquisition." The audience remained silent after Ethan's words. I could feel hundreds of eyes moving between the two of us, waiting for an explanation. Even I did not know what he meant. For a moment, I wondered if there had been some misunderstanding. Ethan looked toward the screen behind us and nodded. Another image appeared. It was not a financial record. It was a photograph. The picture had been taken more than 40 years earlier. I recognized it immediately. Richard and I stood outside the tiny office where the company had first operated. The paint on the building was peeling. The sign above the door was crooked. We looked exhausted and hopeful at the same time. I remembered that day. We had just signed a contract that we believed might save the business. The audience studied the photograph quietly. Then another image appeared. A younger version of me sat behind a cluttered desk surrounded by folders and ledgers. I had completely forgotten the picture existed. Ethan smiled. "When I reviewed the archives, I noticed something unusual," he said. Every major milestone had records attached to it. Contracts, reports, notes. But the most valuable discoveries were not the documents. They were the stories. He turned toward me. "I spent months speaking with retired employees." I blinked in surprise. Ethan continued. "People who worked here 30 years ago still remembered your kindness. They remembered how you stayed late to help them. They remembered how you personally called families when someone was sick. They remembered who kept the company together when difficult decisions had to be made." Emotion tightened my throat. I had not expected that. Numbers and records were one thing. Memories were something else entirely. Ethan faced the audience again. "Every successful organization depends on leadership. But leadership does not always come from the person standing at the microphone." Several guests nodded. The room had become remarkably still. Then Ethan revealed the reason he had invited me. "A few months ago, after learning this history, I established a new initiative within the company." The screen changed once more. A new logo appeared beneath the company name. The Margaret Whitmore Leadership Scholarship. A collective gasp moved through the ballroom. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. Ethan's voice softened. Each year, employees who demonstrate integrity, service, and commitment to others will receive educational support through this program. My eyes filled with tears, though I fought to maintain my composure. Nobody had told me about this. Nobody had even hinted at it. Ethan continued. I wanted the scholarship to carry the name of someone who represented the values that built this company in the first place. The audience erupted into applause once again. This time it felt different. Warmer. More personal. As the applause continued, I glanced across the ballroom. Richard was staring at the screen. The confidence he had carried all evening was gone. Around him, people were no longer discussing the acquisition or the sale. They were discussing the woman whose name now stood at the center of the company's future. Then Ethan leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly enough that only those nearest the stage could hear. Mrs. Whitmore, there is one more thing you deserve to know. The idea for this scholarship came from someone who worked for your husband many years ago. Someone who never forgot what you did for them. He looked toward the ballroom entrance. And at that moment, an elderly man I had not seen in more than 3 decades stepped through the doors. The moment I saw him, recognition came rushing back through decades of memories. His hair was completely gray now. His shoulders were slightly bent with age. But his face was unmistakable. Harold Bennett. 34 years earlier, Harold had been a young warehouse supervisor struggling to support his family. During one particularly difficult winter, his wife became seriously ill and the medical bills nearly overwhelmed them. I remembered the day he sat in my office after everyone else had gone home. He was embarrassed to ask for help. He kept staring at the floor while explaining his situation. Back then, the company was still small. Resources were limited. There were no formal assistance programs. No special funds. Just people trying their best to help one another. I had quietly arranged flexible hours for him. I had helped organize donations from employees. When that was not enough, I paid part of the family's expenses myself. I never told anyone, not even Richard. At the time, it simply felt like the right thing to do. Now Harold slowly approached the stage while the audience watched in complete silence. Ethan stepped aside and offered him the microphone. Harold smiled nervously. I am not used to speaking in front of crowds, he said, causing a few gentle laughs throughout the ballroom. His eyes found mine immediately. But when Mr. Brooks contacted me and asked about the early days of the company, there was one story I knew I had to tell. The room grew quiet again. Harold spoke about the difficult year his family faced. He described the fear of possibly losing everything. He described long nights sitting beside his wife's hospital bed wondering how he would pay the next bill. Then he looked directly at me. Mrs. Whitmore never asked for credit, he said softly. She never told anyone what she did for us. In fact, she asked me not to mention it. I felt my throat tighten. Around the ballroom, guests listened carefully. Some lowered their eyes. Others nodded slowly. Harold continued. What she gave my family was more than money. She gave us dignity. She gave us hope. My wife recovered. My children finished school. Today I have grandchildren because someone chose kindness when nobody was watching. A deep silence settled across the room. It was different from the earlier applause. More personal. More meaningful. Ethan stood nearby with his hands folded respectfully. He understood that this moment no longer belonged to corporate history. It belonged to human memory. Harold smiled through tears. For years, people asked me who built this company. They expected me to name executives or investors. My answer was always the same. He pointed gently toward me. The heart of this company stood behind the scenes. I looked across the ballroom. Several guests were wiping away tears. Even some of the executives who had ignored me earlier now seemed deeply moved. Then I noticed Richard again. He remained completely silent. But something had changed. For the first time all evening, he was not looking at the audience. He was looking at me. And the expression on his face was not pride. It was regret. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Harold stepped away from the microphone and Ethan thanked him quietly before guiding him to a seat near the front. The audience remained unusually still. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Earlier in the evening, people had come to celebrate a business transaction. Now they were witnessing something far more personal. I stood near the podium, feeling as though I were watching my own life unfold from a distance. Ethan allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. There is a reason stories like this matter, he said. Financial statements tell us what a company earns. Records tell us what a company achieves. But character tells us what a company becomes. Several guests nodded. Others listened with their hands folded quietly on the tables. Ethan continued by sharing more discoveries from the company archives. He spoke about letters employees had written over the years, thank you notes, retirement messages, holiday cards. In dozens of them, people mentioned me by name, not because of business decisions, not because of authority. They remembered small acts of kindness, helping a young employee finish college, organizing support for a family after a house fire, spending evenings mentoring new hires who felt overwhelmed, listening when someone needed encouragement. I had forgotten many of those moments myself. Life moves quickly. Years pass. Memories fade. Yet somehow those simple acts had remained with the people who experienced them. The screen behind us displayed excerpts from several letters. My eyes moved slowly across familiar handwriting. One message came from a woman who had started as a receptionist nearly 30 years earlier. Another came from an employee who had worked in shipping. Another from a single father who had struggled during difficult times. Each story revealed something I had never realized. People remembered far more than I thought they did. The audience read the letters in silence. Some smiled. Others wiped their eyes. Near the front of the room, a group of younger employees appeared especially moved. Most of them had never met me before tonight. Yet they were learning a version of the company's history that had never been included in official presentations. Then Ethan shared one final discovery. During the acquisition process, his team had uncovered an internal recommendation written more than 20 years earlier. The proposal suggested creating a formal leadership position for me within the company. My breath caught. I had never seen it before. The recommendation had received strong support from several senior managers at the time, but it had never been implemented. No explanation appeared in the records. I did not need one. Across the ballroom, Richard sat motionless. His face revealed nothing, yet the absence of any reaction seemed to say everything. I felt no anger. Surprisingly, I felt no desire for confrontation either. The years had softened certain wounds while deepening others. What I felt most was clarity. For so long, I had questioned my own memories. I had wondered whether my contributions truly mattered. Tonight, that uncertainty was disappearing piece by piece. Then Ethan looked toward me once more and smiled. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "before this evening ends, there is one decision that belongs entirely to you." The ballroom remained silent as Ethan's words settled over the audience. I looked at him, unsure what decision he could possibly mean. He stepped slightly aside and gestured toward the screen behind us. The logo of the new scholarship remained visible. My name stood there in elegant lettering for everyone to see. For a moment, I simply stared at it. 42 years earlier, I had never imagined wanting recognition. I only wanted to build a future with the man I loved. Somewhere along the way, that future had become his story instead of ours. Ethan smiled gently. "The scholarship exists regardless of what happens next," he said. "But we would be honored if you would serve as its founding advisor." A quiet murmur moved through the room. I felt surprised all over again. "Me?" I asked softly. Ethan nodded. "The values behind this program came from your example. We believe future leaders should learn from the person who inspired it." For a few seconds, I could not speak. Then I looked out across the ballroom. The faces staring back at me were no longer overlooking me. They were listening, waiting, respecting. It was a strange feeling. Not because of the attention itself, but because I realized I no longer needed it. Somewhere during the evening, something inside me had changed. I had spent years wondering whether my contributions mattered. Tonight, I finally understood that they always had. The proof was not on the screen. The proof was in the lives I had touched. In Harold's family. In the letters from employees. In memories that survived long after titles and promotions had faded away. I smiled and accepted the invitation. The applause that followed felt warm rather than overwhelming. Ethan shook my hand. Several guests rose to their feet. Others quickly joined them. Before long, much of the ballroom was standing. I glanced toward Richard one final time. He slowly approached the stage after the applause subsided. The room grew quiet again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me with tired eyes. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I should have thanked you a long time ago." There were countless things he could have said, countless explanations he might have offered. But standing there beneath the lights, I realized I no longer needed any of them. Some wounds heal through apologies. Others heal through truth. Tonight, the truth had finally arrived. I gave him a small nod. Not out of anger. not out of forgiveness, simply acceptance. Then I stepped away from the stage. Guests greeted me as I crossed the ballroom. Some introduced themselves. Others shared kind words. I thanked them politely. When I reached the exit, I paused and looked back one last time. Earlier that evening, I had entered through those doors feeling invisible. I had been seated near the service entrance while others occupied places of honor. Yet I was leaving with something far more valuable than recognition. I was leaving with certainty. The cool Indiana night greeted me as I stepped outside. The city lights shimmered across the skyline. I breathed deeply and smiled. For the first time in many years, I was not walking behind anyone. I was simply moving forward.